So welcome. My name is Kathleen Bush, and I work in our Community Relations Office at King's, and I have the pleasure of working with our alumni, with our churches and pastors, and also with our parents. And we are one of the co-hosts of tonight's event. And so we wanted to do these public lectures. It's a new initiative, and this next three-part series is co-sponsored with the Micah Center, but it's a new initiative out of King's, recognizing our COVID times and our opportunities to meet are a little bit changed during this time. But we also, one of the reasons we're doing it is so that we could highlight the excellent work and scholarship of some of our faculty, so you could hear what they are working on, what their passions are, some of the things they're teaching. And also we wanted to be able to continue to gather alumni and supporters from all over Canada and from all over the world. I think there's a couple of people joining us from various places even tonight, so that we can invite you to engage in lifelong learning. Jonathan is the director of our Micah Center, and I'm going to hand it over to him right now, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the Micah Center and about our upcoming lectures.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I hope you can all hear me. Greetings from the Micah Center at the King's University. The Micah Center's goal is to help King's students and the wider community grow a global vision of justice and renewal. And we aim to bring the claims of the biblical prophet Micah, that's where our name comes from, claims to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God into a world of poverty and global hunger and war. And we do that through courses and through global learning tours, through internships, through global partnerships with folks like World Renew in Honduras. I see Rolando Pinzon from Honduras, so hello, Rolando, nice to see you there. And we also do that through public events like this. And so we're really excited that you're all joining us here and that you are in for a great night of learning with Dr. Harink. I just want to remind all of you that we have a couple of other talks as part of these justice lectures that Kathleen mentioned. On October 19th, Roy Birkenbosch and Ida Castro-Mutoigo from World Renew, Roy Birkenbosch, the founding director of the Micah Center, and Ida Castro-Mutoigo from World Renew, will discuss the implications of the global pandemic on those experiencing poverty around the world. And it will be sort of an interview style talk entitled When Pandemic Meets Poverty. And then on October 26th, King's professor of social philosophy, Dr. Michael Demore, he's going to reflect on what a commitment to public justice might mean for how we think about all of those public monuments to complicated figures in our cities. How do we think about that? How do we think about our response to some of the conversation around that over the last few months? And his talk is entitled Sir John A.'s Severed Head and the Politics of Public Memory. So that's a great title, and it'll be a great night of learning as well. And you can register for both of those through the King's website, as you did for this one. Thanks, and I'll turn it back to you, Kathleen.
Perfect, thanks, Jonathan. So we're really excited about these lecture series. So we're doing the Justice Lecture Series for the month of October. And then in November, you'll hear more about, we're gonna do an Educating for Life series. And we have actually, it's a 5-part series for the month of November. So watch for more information coming in your email soon. So tonight we have Dr. Doug Harink, who's going to be sharing on justice from the book of Romans and from his new book, Resurrecting Justice. And Dr. Steve Martin, one of our theology professors that's worked alongside Dr. Harink since 2004, is going to be introducing him in a moment. Steve is our associate professor of theology at King's. He has interest in South African theology, which you'll hear in his accent, politics, and interest in liturgy, culture, and Christian formation. And again, he's been at King's since 2004, so I think several of you have probably been in his classes over the years. And so Steve will be introducing Doug in a moment. And then Alyssa Jenis, can you wave, Alyssa? There we go. Alyssa is an alumna from King's from 2017, and she graduated from King's with the Governor General Medal in Politics, History, and Economics. She has also read Dr. Harink's book from start to finish and was the undergraduate editor of this book. She is now in law school at U of A, and she will be fielding the questions for us at the end. And so if you know how the chat works down at the bottom in the very middle, you could direct your written questions to Alyssa at some point during Dr. Harink's lecture, and she will be able to field those questions at the end as well. So I will pass this over to Dr. Martin for the introduction.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's such an honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Doug Harink. I actually met Doug 35 years ago when I was a student at what was then called Ontario Theological Seminary, now Tyndale Seminary. And he was a young graduate student at the University of Toronto doing his doctorate on Barth and Schleiermacher. And what I remember about Doug was the provocative, interesting, refreshing new perspectives that he brought on theology of renewal, which was the name of the course, quoting all kinds of people that we weren't really, I wouldn't say that we weren't supposed to read them, but they weren't part of the sort of evangelical canon, as it were. I also remember his really cool Miami Vice type jackets and his floppy hair, which spoke of a really neat fashion sense. Doug was born in Alberta. He's of good Central Albertan Dutch stock. He was educated at Trinity Western, Regent College, and the University of Toronto. And Doug has been at King's for the last 30 years. And most of those years as chair of the theology department. Doug is extraordinarily well respected among students. When I teach other theology students, especially theology majors, they always speak of him with awe. One of them the other day, we were reading a book together, and he says his author actually quotes Douglas Harink. I thought that was so cool. I think that Doug is just highly esteemed by our students. Unfortunately, it's a sad thing as well that Doug will be retiring, although I don't think he's going to be too absent from King's after his retirement. Doug is, in his other scholarly hat, a pioneer in an area bringing the writings and the works of the Apostle Paul into conversation with theology and continental philosophy. He's very involved at high levels in discussions at the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature, and he's held in extremely high esteem among colleagues. So if you pick up his book Resurrecting Justice, you'll find testimonials from people like Philip Ziegler from University of Aberdeen, Fleming Rutledge, the very famous Episcopalian preacher, and Nijay Gupta, biblical scholar. He is held in high esteem among people like Doug Campbell, who I think last week Doug said that Douglas Campbell is sort of on his right shoulder as he writes his work. And I actually sent Doug a message, and I said, I'm introducing our mutual friend Doug Harink tonight. What would you say about him? So I just wanted to read this. Is this okay, Kathleen? Am I going on too long? Okay. Doug is that rare thing, a theologian who knows a lot about Paul, which is always a good thing, and consequently is someone who appreciates that Paul, rightly understood, is a good theologian. Doug's earlier book, Paul Among the Post-Liberals, was a very brilliant and insightful work that grasps many of the key questions within the field. In fact, he anticipated much of the dialogue about the work of Paul. He talked about the way that leading figures were failing to answer these important questions, and he brought in new voices, well, really old voices, but new voices into the discussion. Doug Harink is a person who grasps clear-sightedly the paradigms that are in play, what is at stake, and which paradigm is really grasping even as it is being grasped by the gospel. So those are very high words from Douglas Campbell from Duke University, who is a publisher of many very thick works on the Apostle Paul. I also got a lovely note from Michael Gorman, who talked about how Doug is highly respected among theologians and Pauline scholars for bringing theology and biblical studies together in addressing the contemporary world. So that's Doug's teaching side and his professional research and publication side. I would also say that Doug is a theologian of the church. Looking at his preface to Resurrecting Justice, he acknowledges Anglican churches, Mennonite churches, Christian Reformed churches. He has also been given lectures at Baptist churches, Nazarene churches, all kinds of churches. And last but certainly not least, he is a loving husband and a grandfather to Debbie, Lizzie, and Allison. And I have to say, a doting grandfather to Jack. And it's lovely to see that. And those who know him and who have the privilege of being invited to his home, he is the master of hospitality, a gourmet chef, a lover of good food, fine wine, and well-aged whiskey. So I could go on, but that's enough to give you hopefully a picture of this great friend and colleague. And it's an enormous privilege to introduce him and to be instructed by him this evening.
Thanks, Steve. I should have immediately turned my video off because I could feel my face getting redder and redder. So thanks, Steve. Those are very gracious words, and I might even live up to a couple of them. But anyway, appreciate that very much. Steve is a good friend and has always been super supportive and a great colleague. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to share the screen with a PowerPoint slides. And I'm not going to probably work through all of these slides. Some of them I'll skip over quite quickly, and other ones I will spend a little more time on. But what I want to do is give you some sense of how I think Romans is a book, a letter about justice. And maybe hint a bit at how that letter speaks into our contemporary context, and in particular speaks to Christians and the church in our contemporary context. So some of this will be in some ways a kind of overarching view of the book of Romans, but on the other hand, I'm not going to try to bring you through every chapter and verse. Obviously, that's what the book is for. I will just try to lift out some of the core themes that I think are important. So I'm gonna pop this up on the screen now, if I can find it. I think that's it. There we go. All right. So resurrecting justice, how Romans matters today, and the word "how" there is deliberate. It's a question of, it's not a question of why Romans matters today. Romans always matters, but I think it matters in a particular way if we approach it from the point of view of justice. So that's what I want to do this evening. So how is Romans about justice? And I want to lift out four things that I think testify to the fact that Romans is what I would call a treatise on justice. First of all, there's the language of the letter, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And I believe the letter is filled with the language of justice, which might be somewhat hidden in contemporary translations. I want to talk about the frame of the letter. In other words, the beginning few verses and not exactly the last verses. There's another chapter 16 and there's more of chapter 15, but effectively these first 5 verses and these last half a dozen verses or so frame the entire message of the letter to the Romans. And I want to show how those texts do that and their significance. Well, I obviously can't take you through Romans 1 to 11, but I'm going to approach that under the title Unfolding the New Real. The new real is maybe what I would, is how I might translate the word gospel. And I'll explain why I do that in a few minutes. But unfolding the new real as God's justice, which I think is what Paul does in those chapters. And then toward the end of the letter, Paul engages in a discussion of what does this look like on the ground? What does this look like amongst believers, or as I like to call them, amongst messianics? So that is the last 3 or 4 chapters of the letter to the Romans. So those are the 4 kind of categories under which I want to just lift out some of the important themes of the letter. So first of all, to the language of justice. Now there's a set of Greek words. You can see they all start with that D-I-K stem. And these are the words that usually in our English translations get translated as righteous, to justify or justification, or God justifies. So you can see that the just root remains in that word. And then most extensively, we get the word righteousness, translating this Greek word dikaiosune. What I have done throughout the book is provide an alternate translation of those words. So for this dikaios word, I translate it just. For dikaio, I translate it to do justice or to make justice just. I guess I should have had justice there, never mind. And dikaiosune, I translate consistently as justice. Well, why do I do that? Because Paul does not have 2 sets of words. One, as this first set of words does, one for personal, religious, and moral life, which tends to be the way we read the word righteous and righteousness and to justify and so on. We tend to think of that in terms of our right standing before God and our moral life and those kinds of things. And then typically we have another set of word that talks about things like, social equality or economic distribution of economic funds or political justice, okay? And so we have separated out the meanings into 2 categories, a kind of religious and a kind of social political category. But Paul doesn't have 2 sets of words like that. He's got 1 set of words. And this is the set of words that the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world used to talk about justice, okay? Talk about justice in a city, talk about justice in terms of how a ruler is ruling, talk about justice in terms of right relations between poor and rich and these kinds of things, okay? And so this book is an experiment in translating or thinking of those words in terms of this whole set of just and justice words. What difference does it make if we look at Romans from that point of view rather than this more personal, religious, and moral point of view that's embedded in the idea of righteousness, okay? And I'm not saying it's exclusively embedded in there, but but it's certainly there. Well, okay, so my first, one of my reasons for taking the letter to the Romans as a treatise on justice is, I think the words translate that way, and those words actually occur many, many times throughout the letter to the Romans. Secondly, there's the whole framing of the letter to the Romans. And by that, I mean the opening words and effectively the closing words of Paul's entire discussion in Romans. And I'm just going to lift out a few words here. Interestingly, Paul calls the gospel or the good news of God. So the question of God is at the heart, okay? And you have to think back to the Greco-Roman context, in which, you know, in every city, in every household, in every neighborhood, and at the workplaces and so on, there were many gods and many lords, okay? These gods and lords were what the people honored in some form or another to make sure life went well. So when Paul says it's the good news of God, he means that singular God of Israel. So that's important. He's inserting a new divine reality, or he's announcing, put it that way, a new divine reality into the midst of a very kind of polytheistic and, as Paul would describe it, idolatrous context, okay? But it's a good news also about God's Son. I should have bolded that. And that Son of God is descended from David, according to the flesh, declared to be Son of God with power, and according to the Spirit of holiness by resurrection from the dead. Namely, this is the display of that divine power, okay? Jesus, Messiah, our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the loyal obedience among the nations. Now, most translations render that as the obedience of faith. The word faith could also, and I think in many contexts, should be translated as something like allegiance or loyalty, okay? And so I think Paul is talking about loyal obedience because he's talking about some kind of sovereign ruler in the midst of all of this. So let's just lift out then the key ideas in those few verses. For Paul, the good news is a declaration of divinity, okay? It's a declaration of the one God. And certainly that is, for Paul, the one God of Israel. For him and for us, the only God there is. It's a declaration of sovereignty. And so Paul announces the Davidic Messiah, okay, as the Son of God. And it's important to recognize that that the title Son of God was sometimes used of the emperors, for example, and they were considered to be sons of God. So in the midst of all the sovereignty claims going on in a city like Rome, the listeners to this letter are going to hear something in that title, Son of God, of a sovereignty claim. And certainly if they have any concept of the Jewish promises of a Messiah, they will also, and Paul makes this explicit, saying that according to the flesh he is a son of David, he is in that messianic line, okay? So that's a declaration of sovereignty, okay? We've got divinity, sovereignty, and also a declaration of power. And it's the power of the Spirit that will make a body alive, all right? That's what is meant by resurrection. It's the power of raising bodies from the dead. So that's a power that you could say is active in history insofar as it's in bodies. Okay, and finally then, Paul gives us at the end of that text a call, or the gospel is itself a call to allegiance and obedience from the nations. Just one word about the word nations. Once again, we have a translation thing going on here. Typically, this is translated most often as Gentiles. My problem with the word Gentiles is that it tends to indicate a kind of individualistic understanding. So, you know, you've got a whole bunch of individual Jews and you've got a whole bunch of individual Gentiles, and Paul considers himself to be an ambassador to individual Gentiles. But the fact is, much more properly, that Greek word ethne should be translated nations, because I think Paul, you know, within the context of questions of divinity, sovereignty, and power, I think Paul is, and certainly imagines himself, understands himself to have a mission to the nations. The nations not as individual Gentile persons, but the nations also not only as individual Gentile persons, but also as these corporate entities, these peoples might be a better translation. All right. So that's the opening frame. In the closing frame, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but once again, Paul indicates that the good news is about the nations coming, that the nations might glorify God for his mercy, as it says in verse 9 here. So we're here at the end of the letter, or virtually at the end in Romans 15. So once again, we get this thought of the nations repeated actually quite a number of times in these texts. And again, I think for some kind of, I'm not sure why the translators with respect to these particular texts would go on translating it simply as Gentiles in that what I would consider a kind of individualistic sense. Because if you look at these texts in their Old Testament context, there's no question that the idea of nations is at the forefront, okay? Therefore, I will confess you among the nations and sing praises to your name, says the psalmist. And again, he says, not the psalmist necessarily, but rejoice, O nations, with God's people. There is very clear that on the one hand, you have God's people, Israel, and on the other hand, you have those non-Israelite nations out there that are being called upon to rejoice with Israel. And then, and it's also very clear in verse 11, praise the Lord, all you nations, and let all the peoples praise him, because this word can't be translated individualistically, the Greek word here, okay? So clearly Paul has in mind here some kind of good news about Jesus among the nations, and a call ultimately, at the end of the letter, a call to the nations to gather together with the people Israel in the praise of God and God's ruler. Okay, and again, Isaiah says, Paul says in verse 12, the root of Jesse shall come, the one who rises to rule the nations. Again, why would you translate that as Gentiles in an individualistic sense? Okay, a ruler rules, yeah, to be sure, individuals, but a ruler rules over peoples and nations. Okay. All right. So what's the upshot of this? Just a second here. The good, and again, just to kind of summarize the issue here in the last section of Romans, it's once again a declaration of divinity, okay? It's about the praise and worship of the one God by Israel and the nations. It's a declaration of sovereignty. You know, here, once again, Paul is very explicit about the root of Jesse, a title for the messianic ruler. So it's a declaration of sovereignty over all nations and peoples. It's a prayer to God of hope and power in the Holy Spirit. And I believe that hope then is also a message of hope and power to all peoples, which anticipates the allegiance and obedience from all the nations. You know, the one who rises to rule the nations clearly will expect and call for allegiance and obedience from the nations. So just to sum it up then, and this in some sense, both texts. The one God, the Father, God's Son, the Messiah's sovereign rule, and the divine Spirit's power are the source, shape, and movement of justice in history and among nations. And I think it's important to just say that whenever we enter into a discourse of justice, we're going to have to ask questions. Well, you know, what is the source of justice? Where is your idea of justice coming from, right? Is it made up by the people you belong to? In other words, is it constructed by a certain people, and justice means what it means for those people, but not necessarily for other people? So there's the question of the source of justice. For Paul, it's one God the Father is the source of justice. What is the shape of justice, okay? What does it look like? What does justice look like? What is its form in human relations, okay? And here, Paul will put forward Jesus himself as the shape of God's justice. And finally, and this, by the way, as we will see, in contrast to law. So most often we will think of the shape of justice taking form in law and laws. And Paul will challenge that by saying, in fact, the justice he's talking about looks different from law. It actually looks like Jesus the Messiah. And then he also is, of course, talking about how does justice move in the world, okay? What's the power of justice in the world? And the power of justice in the world usually means the capability of exercising executive power, you know, making sure that justice gets done through police forces and those kinds of things. Well, for Paul, the movement of justice in the world is in fact the divine spirit, okay? In the end, I think you could say what Paul is drawing our attention to in terms of justice is the life of the Holy Trinity and life in the Holy Trinity, okay? So the good news frame of the letter, as we see in Romans 1 and 15, is intensely theopolitical. It's theo, godly, it's about God. It's about God beyond all gods, okay? And that in a fundamental sense as over against polytheistic or idolatrous understandings of God. It's about the sovereign reign of Messiah over all nations, and it's about the holy and life-giving power of the Spirit moving in history, bringing hope, and about the worship and loyal obedience by Israel and all nations and all peoples toward the one God and God's Messiah. So all of this frames Paul's entire discussion in the central bulk of the letter. So, and Paul calls this the good news, and I'm just going to call it the new real. Because I'm calling it the new real because whether one was a Judean in Paul's time or whether one was a Roman, there was a certain there was a certain kind of cultural regime, a social regime, a political regime in place that just made sense of life. Okay, it was the famous Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls it. It was the social imaginary. You know, we're dealing with social imaginaries here, just ways in which life simply makes sense and ways in which one gets by in life with relative ease rather than running up against all kinds of obstacles, okay? That's what we call, you know, what's the real world? Well, take a look around you in Canada. This is, for Canadians, the real world is basically how life gets lived in Canada. And all of the core assumptions we make about, you know, about how things should go are real. Okay, so think the Romans and ordinary Roman citizens and ordinary people in the Roman Empire certainly had some sense of how the world worked, what the world was like, who the gods were, and so on and so forth. That was their real. The Judeans, aka Jews, also had a sense of the real. And for them, the real was effectively that revealed law of God to Moses. And so that shaped their fundamental sense of being in the world. And it's important to realize that for the Jews or Judeans, the law wasn't just a whole bunch of rules to be obeyed. I think we often caricature the Jews that way. No, the law was in fact the very shape of reality. And to live according to the law was to live in line with the real, okay? Well, what happens with the coming of Christ, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his exaltation to lordship is in fact a new real. So into the midst of both of those reals, the Judean and the Roman, Paul announces a new real, namely God and God's own work of liberation and justice. Okay, so the new real gets announced early on in the letter in what I call, maybe it's the thesis statement, if you want to call it that. And so that's just the declaration of the theme. Then Paul, having announced the new real, which sheds its own illuminating light on the world around, engages in a critique of systems, in the systemic bondage to impiety and injustice. And there, in these two chapters, Paul notes that there is a failure of the nation's gods to bring about justice. That's kind of unquestionable for any Judean anyway. But he also, at the end of chapter, or in chapters 2 and 3, points out the limits of Judean law, okay? Basically, he says Judean law is there. In one sense, he has no critique of the law, but he says it hasn't had the power to bring about justice amongst Judeans, okay? So, So where is justice and liberation to be found? Well, for Paul, the singular divine act of justice and liberation, apart from the law, I didn't fill in this, okay. So God does justice, God enacts justice, God brings justice about and brings liberation about, first of all, apart from law, and he does so for Judeans and the Gentile nations. And if you look at this text, this is all about God's work in the death of Jesus Christ to basically bring atonement and mercy to Judeans and Gentiles alike, to Judeans and the nations alike, to Israel and the nations, okay? So all, you could say in one sense, these verses basically say the entire work of justice and liberation is already done in the person of Christ, in that death for the sake of all in Jesus Christ, okay? So that's God's singular act of justice and liberation. And that happens, Paul says, apart from law. So God doesn't depend on law to enact justice in the world, to bring about his own justice in the world. I know this is going fast, but I don't have a lot of time, and I know I would certainly want to leave time for questions. Okay, so the first part of the new real is that announcement about God and the power of God to bring about justice and freedom for all, both for the Judean people and for the nations. And that would include Rome, okay? Rome was very proud of its own understanding of justice and its own bringing about of a kind of justice in the world. They went out and conquered other peoples because they thought that Roman justice was good news, not just for Rome, but also for other peoples. And so they went out and brought people within the orbit of Rome's vision of justice and peace and security. For Paul to announce in the midst of all of that, that in fact, justice and peace and liberation is to be found in Jesus Christ is something rather shocking and really, in some fundamental sense, unimaginable. Because in some sense, you can't see it, right? Why does Paul point to the death of Jesus and say, there God's justice becomes manifest? He stresses the fact that in the death of Jesus Christ, God's justice is somehow revealed, made manifest, is seen and visible. How is the death of someone the manifestation and visibility of God's justice? Well, it is because God raises Jesus from the dead, but it is also because this is how God has determined to do justice in the world. Okay, so so that is a rather well, it's a stunning declaration of the meaning of justice. It's a declaration that in many respects might not make sense to many people, and yet it is the one that Paul makes in the midst of these other visions of justice, the Roman and the Judean visions of justice, that could easily contest Paul's declaration of God's justice in the death of the Messiah. All right, well, so how does one then, as it were, come to see or recognize or be part of God's movement of justice in the world? Well, in the first place, interestingly, Paul turns to trust. Okay, and here he brings forward Abraham. And we could get stuck in this chapter forever, but so we're not going to do that. But Abraham says, Paul says, you know, back before there was a law, back before there was the law of Moses, there was Abraham. And he trusted God, the God who creates and resurrects, or rather the God who resurrects and creates, because after all, Paul says Abraham's and Sarah's bodies were as good as dead when God made a promise of new life to them, okay? And made a promise of inheriting the world to them. Interesting, a very stunning kind of phrase there too. Abraham trusted God, Paul says, and God reckoned it or counted that trust as justice. That was justice. That was Abraham's justice, okay? This is an odd thing because Paul stresses that Abraham wasn't striving for justice, wasn't working for justice, wasn't protesting for justice. Abraham believed God's promise of justice and walked in that trust, walked in trusting in God's justice. And that, Paul says, God accounted as Abraham's justice. That's the way Abraham does justice, by trusting God. And Paul says, you know, as it was for Abraham, so it is to be for us who should walk in the footsteps of Abraham. Okay, so justice comes about through trust. Then Paul turns his attention back to Jesus and speaks about how and here Paul stretches out in some ways to the very beginning of the biblical story, where he says the Messiah is in fact the new Adam, or the new humanity. You see how it's all coming to a new real here, right? So it's not just a real world, a new real world. In the coming of Christ, there is a new humanity, a new real humanity. Okay, you want to know what human being looks like in truth? Look at Jesus. Okay, so Jesus manifests his this new humanity, or this true humanity, in doing justice himself. His life is construed by Paul as, his entire life is construed as one act of justice. And in that, Christ defeats the powers of injustice, namely the powers of sin and death, which Paul has focused on in that chapter, okay? All right, so there is trust, which God reckons as justice, and there is participating in the new humanity, namely Jesus himself, participating in the just one. These are the two ways in which we become just, by trust and by participation in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And the sign of that participation for Paul is in fact baptism. We die with Christ and we are raised up with Christ into the new life, okay? Paul takes a quick turn at one point and says, well, listen, what about law? Where does law fit in this understanding of justice? You can imagine that this is a question not only that Judeans would raise, of course they would, because their entire life is lived within the context of the real of the law of Moses and all that that is revealed to them about God and God's claim on their lives and so on and so forth, okay? So certainly Paul has to address the question of law for his Judean readers, but he also has to address the question of law certainly for Romans or any other group of people within the Roman Empire or amongst the non-Jewish peoples, right? What's the role of law? Well, Paul says, you know, law is not a bad thing. It's just not a powerful thing. It's weak. Paul says law is weak. And in fact, and I argue this in the book, I argue that Paul thinks law is good when it is weak. If law gets strong, it's because it's been taken up by sin and death and has become an instrument of injustice rather than justice, which is a strange thing to say. But I think Paul believes that when law is weak, in other words, when it's what I would just call a kind of cultural form of life, it's a good thing. It does, in fact, get us from day to day. You know, I use the example in the book of traffic lights. You know, a traffic light gets people, traffic lights throughout the city get people safely from one destination to another. And we hardly think about traffic lights as law. In fact, most of the time we're thinking about something else. Maybe you're texting on your phone when you're driving. You shouldn't do that. That's against the law. And there's good reasons why you shouldn't do that. But you know, if you're just driving to and from work every day, you barely even know that you're stopping at a red light. You just do it, okay? And so when law kind of functions in that weak sense, not as a thou shalt or thou shalt not, but just as how to get by from day to day, I think Paul says law is a good thing. But one thing it doesn't do is give justice and life, okay? And so if you rely on law to bring about justice and life, you're putting your confidence in the wrong place. For that, you need to put your trust in the Spirit of Jesus Messiah, okay? And so Paul, I should have Romans 8 here. Sorry, I should have Romans 7 here and Romans 8 here. I forgot to put the references in there. For Paul, the power of justice is the Spirit of Jesus. For Paul, the power of life, and of course, the only reason we need justice is so that we can live. So the power of justice and life for Paul is in fact the Spirit of Jesus Messiah. And by that, I think he means something quite specific, namely that same Spirit that led Jesus into the kind of life he lived, okay? And the kind of life that Jesus lives, not just the fact that he lived and died, but the kind of life that Jesus lived is in fact central and critical for Paul's understanding of the kind of life that we are called to live in the power of the Spirit of Jesus, okay? It's the Spirit of Jesus that empowers us to live the kind of life that Jesus did. And because it's the life that Jesus lived, it is the power of justice and life. All right. Well, there's another part, and this is a part that many, many people skip over in their readings of Romans because, well, it's all about Israel, and I'm not Israel, okay? And why anyway does Paul bring this largest chunk of material into the middle of this letter? Clearly, something is of fundamental importance for him here. And here we have to go back to the idea of the nations, okay? The question for Paul is Israel, or will Israel become a people of justice? And under what conditions will they do so? Okay. Will Israel be that divinely chosen nation among nations to display to the nations the true nature of God's justice in Messiah and the Spirit? And here Paul is basically saying, going back to the calling of Israel from its very origins. What is the calling of Israel? It is to be that light in the midst of the nations, that light of justice and life in the midst of the nations. And yet Israel hasn't turned to that place where God has revealed his own justice and life. So in Paul's day, as throughout most of history, the Judean people, the people of Israel have not sought justice in Jesus Messiah and the Spirit, but have sought it effectively in their own way of life, okay? Their own form of life. And Paul, basically goes through a very long and rather convoluted argument to address the question, why is this happening? Why is God's very own chosen people not turning to that very source of justice and life in the Messiah and the Spirit when that has been in fact revealed to them? Well, he actually says, in part, that's God's fault. God's got some reason going on there for Israel not believing in that good news. Now, the reasons in Paul's time and the reasons that he gives are not necessarily the reasons since then, because, Gentiles and even the church throughout the centuries have been, in many respects, very wicked to the Jewish people. And so if Israel doesn't believe, or Judean people don't believe in Jesus and the Spirit in our time, that has a lot to do with the way they've been treated by Gentiles and Christians. But Paul has actually some fairly specific theological reasons, the core of which is that because Israel has not sought its justice and life in Messiah and the Spirit, the Gentiles, Paul has, as it were, gone to the Gentile nations, and they're turning to God. And so Paul sees God's purpose at work in all of this. We can't go into all of that in detail. For the time being, though, it seems that Israel has decided not to be that light of justice and life to the nations. Only a remnant has. And for Paul, that means effectively those Judeans who in his time are believing in Jesus as Messiah and the source of justice and life. But ultimately, Paul says, yes, Israel will become that people, okay? And they will become that people because God will come to them and turn them back into that people. Well, what all that means, historically speaking, is difficult to know, but this is how Paul understands it. The core point here is that Paul turns back to the idea of Israel as that chosen people of God and asks the question, what is God doing here with this people whose very purpose in being called out from, well, at least one of their very purposes of being called out from the nations, is to stand in the midst of the nations and display in the midst of the nations God's justice and life to them, which God has now revealed to be there in the Messiah and the Spirit. All right, we're nearly at an end, and then we can, this is going faster than I thought, so maybe I've talked too fast or moved through some of this too quickly. If you have questions, I think we're going to have plenty of time left for them. Okay, well, rather disturbingly, many readers of Romans figure that the important stuff is there at the end, okay? How to live the Christian life. And that's basically, in some respects, what Paul is getting at in those last several chapters. But for Paul, it isn't just, a bunch of instructions on kind of doing the right thing and being the kind of people God wants us to be and so on and so forth. For Paul, it is in fact living in the new real, okay? This is life in the reality of God. This is life in the reality of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is life lived with that as the most fundamental presupposition of life. And the fact, as Paul has said extensively throughout the letter, that in the reality of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and through that reality, God has righted the world, okay? God has made the world right. And the call then is to live into that reality of God's making the world right through the Messiah and the Spirit. So to live into that real. And so if you're just kind of standing outside and saying, oh, here's where we get our instructions about how to live a life. Well, yes, but this is life on the assumption of everything else that Paul has said in the rest of the letter. Okay? And so that's why I think it's important to struggle as much as possible through all of those early chapters of Romans, so that you have some sense of the real that Paul is believing we in fact live in, and in fact the whole world lives in, okay? Not just believers, but the whole world lives in the reality of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and is called to come to acknowledge that as the real, and to take up their lives as lives lived within that real. Okay. But what does Paul then say? Well, he goes on and gives, and you know, these are fairly straightforward in many ways. He goes on to describe life in the Messianic assembly. Now, I've spoken of this as Messianic rather than Christian. And I've spoken of it as Messianic because the shape of this living in the real, in the new real, the shape of life on the ground in the new real is given its life on the ground is given its shape in the life of Jesus Christ, okay? The very character of that life. So it isn't just that Jesus came, lived whatever kind of life he lived, which doesn't matter very much, and then the most important thing, he died on the cross to save us from our sins and was raised from the dead, so we have the promise of eternal life, which is often the way we read the good news. The fact is, the very character and shape and kind of life that Jesus lived gives us the character and shape and kind of life that we are called to live in the new real. And so that's why I call it the Messianic. You know, it's a Messianic life. It's not a religion, it's a kind of life shaped by the Messiah. And so he speaks in chapter 12, these are just kind of rough and ready demarcations here. Living peaceably among saints, strangers, and enemies. You know, saints, the ones, their fellow believers. Strangers, well, those neighbors around them who aren't part of the assembly, but there is a life lived always, of course, with one's neighbors and in the world with people who don't share this understanding of the new real. And then, of course, there are even enemies, people who, for some reason or another, will attack those who live within and live out of the good news of the Messiah, okay? So Paul gives us, as I say, relatively straightforward instructions in Romans 12. It's not a good idea to separate, as I have done here, it's not a good idea to separate Romans 13 from Romans 12, because in fact, this entire text runs into, you know, the text of Romans 12, probably starting around verse 19, runs into Romans 13, and Romans 13 has to be read in the context of and in the light of Romans 12. Because this is that famous passage, particularly the first 7 verses, that famous passage in Romans 13 where Paul says, let everyone be subject to, or everyone be submit to the governing authorities. And that particular text has been taken so often throughout Christian history to be, as it were, the authorization for all kinds of political authority, whether it be kings or democratically elected governments or whatever. I mean, you hear it quoted in the United States far too frequently, on the assumption that somehow or other, if we want to talk about important political things from the point of view of the gospel, we should turn to Romans 13. Because there Paul starts talking politically. There he starts talking about political systems. Well, I hope I've made it clear, particularly by looking at the frame of Romans, that the entire letter to the Romans is in fact a political vision. And one thing that entire alternative political vision has to do is take account of whatever's in place at the time in terms of political authorities. So Paul says, okay, they're there, got it. There are those political authorities. I can't go into detail, you've got to buy the book and read it for this, but I'm saying that effectively what Paul is asking us to do is be messianic anarchists. Now, no, those two words have to go together, because messianic means to be people who live without that much regard for the political authorities, but that live like the Messiah, okay? So this clearly can't mean anarchists who run around with clubs and guns and weapons and destroy buildings and burn things down and so on and so forth. It simply doesn't mean that. What I mean by messianic anarchists is that we become unbelievers in what we think is the good of worldly powers and their systems. And by unbelievers, I don't mean that we reject them or pretend they're not there, but we simply don't end up thinking that they are the place where we will find God's justice and life. Sadly, I mean, just take a look at the United States right now, but the United States is far from the only place where this happens. It's the one that's in our face in Canada all the time. People believe far more in the worldly powers and their systems than they do in God and the Messiah. Evangelical Christians believe far more in the good of worldly powers and their systems than they believe in the good news of the Messiah. Paul is not saying believe in those governing authorities. He says, there they are, submit to them, and then get on with the far more important of fulfilling the good of the law of love, which is how he concludes Romans 13. So within the context of the entire letter to the Romans, Romans 13, 1-7 is a relatively small little item, and it's just Paul's way of getting the powers out of the way of the gospel, okay? That's crucial to see. Okay, carrying on. How else do people live the new real? What's the shape of messianic justice on the ground? Well, it's through messianic fellowship, dining with the others. And here Paul pays a lot of attention, as he does in almost all of his letters, to eating and drinking together. And the fact that those who normally would be at odds and enemies of one another perhaps, or at least despising one another, gather at the dining table and work out life together around food and drink. I should have Romans 14 here. That's what Romans 14 is all about. And I start off that chapter by saying justice begins at the dining table. Okay, justice begins at the dinner table. Because if people can't work out life and messianic life at the dinner table, where they meet concretely face to face around food and drink, it will be hard to do so at those higher systemic levels where we think justice and life should happen. Okay, finally, at the end, and here I should have Romans 15, I forgot to put some of these references in. Paul ultimately concludes, and we've already looked at this text right at the beginning, that the shape of justice and life on the ground amongst messianics is in worship, namely praising the one God, God of Israel, and God's Messiah, the one sovereign of Israel and the nations. So that is these four little bullet points here effectively in some ways kind of sum up what Paul says in those last few chapters about, what would justice on the ground amongst those who have heard and believed the new real, what would it look like? And he sketches it out for us here in these last several chapters. All right, I guess what I've done is given you a kind of quick overview of the letter, but hopefully lifting out and perhaps enabling you in some measure to take a new look at Romans, to read it as a treatise on justice, to understand that it's about a far more than my own individual personal life before God, and perhaps in relation with a few others, that really this is, the letter to the Romans is casting a vision of the whole of reality under the lordship of Jesus Christ within the living and dynamic reality of the Spirit, and ultimately within the life of the triune God. So I think I'll end there and open it up.
So thanks for that, Doug. I have to say, I still struggle calling you Doug. I want to say Dr. Harink, but
Go for it.
it's good. I've actually graduated law school now, so I got to learn to have some guts with my
Oh,
real adult
fantastic.
job. So we have a few questions here for you, and I also have many questions, but I'll ask other people's first because, you know, I could ask you questions all night long. So I figure I should give other people a chance to have their voices heard. So
Sure.
we have a question asking about how Paul defines divine justice. And the question is, would you say that Paul defines divine justice as overwhelming mercy and grace based on the covenant God makes with Abraham in Genesis 15?
I would say that it is, I would say in general, I would agree with that, but I would not refer back to the covenant that God makes with Abraham in Genesis 15. Of course, that's part of it. And Paul catches up the story of Abraham into his account of God's overwhelming grace and mercy in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So Abraham is, the reality of Abraham is caught up into the new real, but I wouldn't immediately turn back to Abraham and say that's where it all happened. How does Jesus Christ fit into the picture of Abraham? I mean, it's clear that in some sense Christ is anticipated in Abraham, but I would say Christ doesn't fit into the picture of the covenant with Abraham. Abraham and God's covenant with Abraham fits into the picture of Jesus Christ. So it's a way of kind of saying, well, what's the larger reality here of God's grace and mercy within which the story of Abraham fits?
Great, thank you. We also have another question sort of related to the final points that you made about practically applying these important points. And the question is essentially, who would Paul say is your neighbor?
Whoever is there. And there, I think he would answer exactly in the same way as Jesus would answer. So in Romans 12, particularly toward the end portion of Romans 12, Paul takes account of the fact that that you're living together with fellow believers, that you're living together with, I'll just call them people on the street, your neighbors around you. You know, the assemblies in Rome and other cities in the ancient Near East there were not kind of closed off buildings from the rest of life. They were very often artisan shops or somebody's atrium or something like that, sometimes open to view from the streets and this kind of thing. So there's all those people around you that are your neighbors. But he also then talks about enemies. What do you do with enemies? Well, interestingly, he gives exactly the same instructions about enemies as Jesus does. Okay, do good to those who hate you. So, who is my neighbor? Who's there beside you? Who's around you? Who's in front of you? That's your neighbor. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. So I also have many questions. So we'll see if more people add questions to the chat here, and I'll keep you updated. One of my questions is about this new reel that you're talking about. I'm wondering, so sometimes I think in our world, in Western culture, we're really focused on eradicating suffering or alleviating suffering, and I think that that's a really strong foundation for a lot of the trends that we see in, for instance, like the social justice sort of movements and our general rhetoric and our expectations from our governments and from our law and our judicial systems. And something that's striking about this letter, or about Paul's discussion in Romans, is the implications that has for how we see suffering in the world. And what I'm thinking about specifically is the relationship between like what Jesus's life, death, and resurrection does. It brings us to be able to commune with God, to dwell with him. And in Revelation 21, for instance, in verses 1-4, we see this city, this dwelling place that God has among us. And then the next sentence after that is about how God will wipe the tears from our eyes, and etc. And suffering is eradicated because we will be one with God.
Right.
So I'm wondering, how does that definition of justice, the global sort of way that Paul defines justice in Romans, how does that affect how we see suffering in the world around us?
Yeah.
And as Christians, like, is there a tension there in living out life in the midst of suffering?
Well, it's pretty clear that Paul doesn't envision his, the people of his assemblies, the believers in Jesus. Paul doesn't envision them as escaping suffering.
Yeah.
On the contrary, he basically says, you got to expect this. You're not going to have a good life if you think a good life means that you're going to get out of suffering. All's now going to be well for you. Nobody's going to be mad at you anymore or hurt you. I'm just working through in the Paul course, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Suffering is effectively part of what it means to live in the new real, because living in the new real runs against the grain of other reals in some pretty profound ways. Mm-hmm. So there's no sense in which Paul thinks that the new real is going to deliver us from suffering in this world. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at the very point in the middle of Romans 8, where he's talking about the glory about the coming glory that we can look forward to, he says, yeah, but you need to suffer. You need to join in with the sufferings of Christ if you want to share that glory. So that also gets to the question, well, what about, like where do Christians, how do Christians engage the suffering in the world? Mm-hmm. Well, to a certain extent, by being there amongst the suffering, okay? And that's not so that we can enjoy suffering. I don't think Paul ever asks us to enjoy suffering. But it is the reality in a world that lives by reals other than the real of the gospel, okay? It's a reality in the world. And so the place to be, as Christ was, the place to be is in the midst of that, basically doing good in the midst of that, bringing the good news, and I mean that concretely in terms of being there with saints, strangers, and enemies amongst our neighbors, being and doing the good news in their midst. But I don't think Paul thinks that somehow or other the end game in this world is to deliver everyone from suffering. I think he just thinks that that's, if I can put it this way, pie in the sky. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen, and in any case, it wasn't. Don't expect it as a result of the gospel. I don't know if that gets at it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great. Thank you.
I see Steve has a question here in chat.
Yes, he does. Do you have access to it? Can you read it?
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead.
So he says, what would Paul say about non-messianic political movements that have Christ-shaped elements? Do they also participate in the coming of Messiah? By non-messianic, I mean non-Christian. Yeah. Because I think God in as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God as present with us through the Messiah and the Spirit, is not the Christian God in the sense that somehow or other we've got an exclusive handle on that God, or we've got that God in our box and somehow this God isn't working out beyond us. So I mean, if this is the new real, and by that I mean the new ultimate real for all creation, and of course it's the old real, right? This is God the Creator. If this is the real, and maybe that's more important to say than the new real, if this is the real for all humankind, for all the earth, for all of history, if that's the real, then certainly we must expect the real to be at work in this world beyond the Christian assemblies, okay, beyond messianic assemblies. And so when Steve says, movements that have Christ-shaped elements. By that he means, elements that have something of the character of Christ's own life, and his own way of being in the world and his own way of acting in the world. There are lots of movements like that. Movements that work peaceably in the world to bring about good, okay? I think they participate in the coming of Messiah. Messiah has come. Messiah is at work in the world. The Spirit is at work in the world. And so I mean, I've probably brought this up once before, but in the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the States, something like 97% of all of the protests and demonstrations have been peaceable, okay? We fixate on the ones that where some people get unruly, and who knows who the unruly people are. But is that messianic? Is there something intrinsically messianic about that? I believe there is, and I think we can look at that and say, is that the power of the Spirit of the Messiah at work? Why wouldn't we say that? You see, very often, if we want to ask the question, where is God at work in history? Our eyes end up getting fixated on the rulers and the people in high places and the elites and all the wonderful things they can do or all the bad things they do, right? If I just had enough power in this world, I could bring about good for the whole world. I mean, that stupid question that gets asked of, contestants in certain things. Anyway, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but why do we fixate on all of those places that don't have that messianic character, that don't look like the character of Jesus, and think that somehow that's where God is at work in the world? Well, God is not absent from that. But if you want to see where God is at work in the world, look at those movements that have that Messiah-like character, that have that character that looks like Jesus. And you can look around the world and see many of those. And there, I think those who know the Messiah can say, I think the Spirit of the Messiah might be at work in those places.
So as a follow-up question to that, do you think, well, I'm wondering if I'm wondering about the limits of that position and what your thoughts on those are, because it seems to me that on the one hand, it's dangerous to sort of look for those kinds of things in history or in our current political climate, because we would be in danger of relying on the kingdom that Christ brings and not the king himself, and then be trusting really in the good that can be brought about as a result of those movements.
Yeah.
Am I understanding you correctly, or is
yeah? Well, I said this in the interview a week ago. All of the work for justice, and you can imagine what that might look like in all kinds of ways. But all of the work for justice, if it is to be just, must share that shape, that messianic shape of Jesus' own life, okay? And that means that at a certain point, if it looks like the job is not getting done, our temptation is then to say, okay, well, what we really need to do is now get our hands on a little bit more power, okay? Or maybe get the right judge in place, or if we can just do that, then this good that we're seeking will be accomplished, and more people will benefit from it, and so on and so forth. So out of that desire to see justice done, which is a good desire, I think people often are tempted to think that it's necessary to engage the world in unjust ways. And by unjust ways, I mean ways that do not share in the reality of Jesus Messiah. Okay, so yeah, there are always temptations. There are temptations in every movement for justice and even Christian movements for justice. I mean, let's face it, all kinds of kings have reigned cruelly over people thinking that they're enacting God's justice in the world, right? But they don't, but their lives and the shape of their exercise of justice doesn't look anything like Jesus at all.
Mhm.
So, so there's always that temptation.
Hmm.
There's always the temptation to effectively give ourselves over again to the principalities and powers of this age. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. So Roy Birkenbosch asked if the powers can be redeemed, and if so, what does that mean for our relationship to them? I'm not sure if you know what he means by the powers, but
Yeah.
I'll ask Roy to speak up if that needs
Well,
to
he
be
means
defined.
the worldly powers. He means
Okay, there we go.
presidents and prime ministers and parliaments and those kinds of things. You know, Roy never tires of asking me that question. You know, it's even in Romans 13, Paul doesn't simply say that what's going on in the governing authorities is evil. He says, you know, they do stuff, and some of the stuff they do is not bad. Like they reward the good and they punish the evil. Although notice that the language of reward and punishment is not gospel language. In fact, it's the language that basically Paul wants to get us out of. You know, it's the whole idea that somehow or other justice is about rewards and punishments. So there's no indication in Romans 13 that the powers that be are real instruments of justice. But you know, there they are. You know, maybe you're a member of Parliament. I know someone close to you is a member of Parliament, Alyssa, and you're doing what you can. I say, go for it. But you know, what are you expecting? What are you hoping for? What's going to happen? What do you think needs to be done to make sure that happens? What are you going to put in place? What kind of executive powers are you going to put in place to make sure quote unquote justice gets done? So, you know, I don't think I have any notion of prohibiting anything. Get involved, but don't kid yourself about redeeming the powers. They're not going to be redeemed. They ultimately are going to be destroyed as they're put under the lordship of Christ, but Christ is the one who will do that. Okay, so you're not going to we're not going to redeem the powers. If ultimately God does some redemptive work with the powers, well, first of all, that's I don't know, the destruction and redemption, you could say, has been done in Christ. But don't think that if you're going to become the Prime Minister of Canada, you're finally going to be there redeeming the power of Canadian government. You're just going to be part of it. You're going to be part of the worldly powers. You're going to be sucked into the principalities and powers as much as anyone else, okay? And I think the higher up the power chain you go, the more likely you are to be sucked into the principalities and powers and unredeemed by them. So that's my answer, okay? Again, I don't think it's prohibited for a Christian to be a member of Parliament. Why not? Just know the limits of what that means, and don't expect that somehow or other you are going to deliver the government of Canada from its unredeemed misery.
Well, on that positive note, I'll turn it back over to Kathleen. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thanks, Alyssa and Doug and Stephen for sharing tonight and helping us think more thoughtfully about justice and the book of Romans. I do know that Roy is on there. Roy, I don't know if you're still listening, but if you wanted to come on and say a few words about your lecture coming up in 2 weeks, we'd be happy to hear that. Otherwise, Jonathan, I'd have you just recap what we're doing in 2 weeks and 3 weeks from now.
I'll wait to see if Roy.
Yeah, hi there, Kathleen and
Hi.
everyone else. I'm downstairs, Doug. I'll talk to you afterwards. That's
Okay.
your answer assumed a very different question than I was asking. I think that in 2 weeks, I hope to be here with Ida Matoigo. She's the Canadian Director of World Renew. And we want to have a conversation together about how the pandemic is exacerbating the suffering of people, particularly in communities of poverty. And some of those ways are the loss of livelihood for many people, the inability to socially distance in crowded slums and refugee camps, the increase in gender violence against women, and so on. So a lot of those things that were existent in communities of poverty around the world, those have become really exacerbated by the pandemic. And the pandemic has really exposed, I think, some of the inequalities and some of the injustices that do exist in the world. And so we're going to talk about that, but not only about the exacerbation of suffering, but also talk about what kinds of steps organizations like World Renew and others like it, faith-based community development organizations and relief organizations, what are they doing, and how can local Christian organizations, churches, individual members support that and come alongside of that initiative. So that's what's going to happen in 2 weeks.
Perfect. Thanks, Roy. Jonathan, anything to add, or you?
No, that's great. Yeah, and then just a reminder too, the week after Roy and Ida share with us, Michael Demore will be sort of leading us in a reflection on how we can think about these public monuments to complicated historical figures like Sir John A. Macdonald and others, Robert E. Lee in the United States, and others like them. And that's entitled Sir John A.'s Severed Head and the Politics of Public Memory. So that will be on October 26th.
Perfect. And I just noticed that Jack Tigan is saying that 100% of proceeds for this week from park lighting are going to World Renew. So if you need light fixtures or some furniture, know that 100% is going to World Renew. So that's a great thing.
Kathleen, can I just interject?
Sorry, go Roy.
Yeah, it's not this Saturday.
Oh, sorry. When is it?
Oh, no, you're right. It is this Saturday. Time flies. My word. Okay, it is Thanksgiving weekend. Okay.
Thanksgiving weekend. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah, head on over to Park Lighting to get your light fixtures and support World Renew at the same time. Just want to give a shout out to different people that are joining us from around the world. I know we had some Ontario people leave already because they're 2 hours ahead, but we have Rolando from Honduras joining us. We have President Melanie Humphreys, Mom and Dad Bill and Fran Humphreys. They're joining us from 100 Mile. And I'm not sure where everybody else is from, but that's one of the great things that we could do right now is that have people join us from all over the place in all different time zones. So thank you for doing that. We will be back here in 2 weeks. So thank you again to Doug and to Stephen and for Alyssa for helping us have this conversation about justice and Romans. We do have copies of Doug's book still available at King's for $25. Otherwise, you can find it online at Amazon and have it shipped right to you. Yeah, Stephen is holding it up there. So it's a great book. And so you could contact myself or Ashley Patton, who has been running things from behind the scenes for us tonight. And so we're both in community relations. So thank you everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
I want to thank you, Kathleen, and Ashley, and Alyssa, and Steve for all you've done. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome.